A pogrom is a violent uprising aimed at the massacre or persecution of a specific ethnic group. The word is Russian and means to wreak havoc or to demolish violently. The term was first used in reference to violent attacks on Jews in the Russian Empire during the 19th and 20th centuries. And many pogroms have occurred in various other parts of the world, including Ireland, Poland, Argentina, Palestine, and Nazi Germany. Pogroms have also occurred in the United States and have been directed at African Americans. The worst pogrom, or massacre of African Americans, took place in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. This presentation will explore and discuss this horrendous, destructive episode of American history and present the following information: a detailed account of the event, including causes and consequences, eyewitness accounts of what took place from some of the survivors, and press reporting of the massacre from both white and black-owned newspapers. On May 30th of 1921, 19-year-old shoeshiner Dick Rowland was arrested for assaulting Sarah Page, a white girl of 17 who was employed as an elevator operator. There are conflicting accounts as to what actually happened between Rowland and Page. But once a white clerk in the nearby Renberg store reported an assault after hearing the girl scream and observing Rowland fleeing from the scene at the Drexel building, the police apprehended the black man and placed him in jail. White citizens attempted to lynch him while blacks gathered to thwart the mob's efforts. What resulted afterwards was 16 hours of mayhem that culminated with the destruction by burning of the Greenwood district of Tulsa, also known as Black Wall Street. One of the most successful black communities in the United States. "35 city blocks and over 1,250 residences were destroyed. Hundreds of people were injured, and many Tulsans lost their lives. The official estimate of the number of deaths was set at 35, 9 whites and 26 blacks, but this number is obviously too low. Estimates that are more realistic indicate at least 75 to 100 people, both black and white, were killed during the massacre. A reliable source, who was the director of relief efforts for the American Red Cross, Maurice Willows, noted in his official account of the carnage that the actual number of deaths due to the pogrom may have been as high as 300. The real problem in ascertaining an accurate body count generated by the event at Tulsa is that many of the African American dead were evidently thrown into unmarked graves, like slaughtered livestock, and thus never accounted for. Mention is made of a coal mine once located at 21st and Yale, where many of the bodies were thrown. That particular area is now a Sears parking lot. Survivors stated that corpses were stacked onto wagons and trucks. There were also reports that bodies were put on flatbed railroad cars and moved by rail from Tulsa. A study was done to identify possible mass grave locations. Reports had centered around 3 memorial parks in Tulsa: New Block Park, Oak Lawn Cemetery, and Booker T. Washington Cemetery. Researchers David L. Maxey and Jeffrey Jones conducted a geophysical examination of the 3 suspected sites using a ground-penetrating radar unit, which is able to detect anomalies from reflections in disturbed soil commonly associated with the grave shaft, such as bones, coffins, grave goods, and breakdown in normal soil conditions. At New Block Park, which is located near the Arkansas River, adjacent to Greenwood, a discovered anomaly indicated a buried object of some nature, and one section of the graveyard showed sloping reflections that might represent the walls of a shallow excavation or pit. There were also anomalies apparent at Booker T. Washington Cemetery, one of which measured about 6.5 meters, 20 feet, by 3 meters, 9 feet, extending to a depth of at least a meter, and perceived to potentially represent a pit, such as one might find with a mass grave. The events that transpired in Tulsa at the end of May and the 1st of June 1921 can most certainly be described as a pogrom, since it was a planned event with an ultimate goal being the destruction of Greenwood and as many of its African American citizens as possible. Accounts of the pogrom in most newspapers and history books call it a riot, but it is more appropriate to refer to it as an example of ethnic cleansing, since attempts were being made by numerous whites to eradicate as many blacks as possible. One description of what happened in Tulsa describes the actions of these so-called white forces, who were reported to be shooting into houses and all Negroes in sight. Besides using firearms to kill people, in the skies above, planes flew over Little Africa, apparently firing and dropping sticks of dynamite and other incendiaries. These aircraft flew over the area to not only spy on the movements of the Negroes, but also to drop bombs on the colored sections where they resided. Accounts indicate that more than a dozen aeroplanes went up and began to drop turpentine balls upon the Negro residences, while the 5,000 whites with machine guns and other deadly weapons began firing in all directions. One of the survivors of this disastrous slaughter was a gentleman by the name of Otis Clark. When the event occurred, Otis was only 18 years of age. He provides his recollections of the episode on voicesofoklahoma.com in an oral history composed of recordings made on November 23, 2009, when he was 106 years of age. The events that occurred are described intensely by Mr. Clark. He did not find out about exactly what had happened regarding Rowland and Page until after the event. He was concerned primarily at the start of the vehemence with preserving his life and those of his friends and family members. The idea was to leave Tulsa as soon as possible to make sure that he and his family did not become victims of violence. At one point, Otis decided to go to his cousin's house that was located on the outskirts of Greenwood. Then they traveled to Claremore and stayed in a hotel. Otis's home was wiped out by fire, and his pet bulldog, Bob, was nowhere to be found. In recalling the pogrom, Otis Clark made some startling comments. He stated that the death toll was claimed to be about 300, but it was even more than that. No funerals were held for the victims. He also noted that the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was an integral part of the riot, and according to Mr. Clark, had taken over and didn't let the folks have any law, rights, or anything like that. They just killed the folks, all that they wanted to kill. Otis makes clear that the KKK was a dominant force in Tulsa for many years. He stated that the white supremacist organization basically took over the city of Tulsa, and the colored folks couldn't do anything. Another witness to the pogrom in Greenwood was Mary E. Jones Parrish. She describes the massacre in a book entitled Events of the Tulsa Disaster, published the year following the catastrophe. Her work presents a compilation of survivor accounts accompanied by her own perspective as an eyewitness to what transpired. Before the event, she described Tulsa as a place of peace and happiness. However, after May 31st and June 1st, her sentiments changed to deep and quiet sorrow. Parrish's expression of the cause of the disaster was a threatened lynching bee, because the men of color rose up in defense of the law and to protect a fellow man from the hands of the lawless horde that had gathered around the jail. Parrish presents her book in hopes that it will not only open the eyes of the thinking people of America to the impending danger of letting such conditions exist and remain within the land of the free and the home of the brave, but at the same time pay homage to the martyrs of the Tulsa disaster and massacre. Another witness to what transpired in Greenwood was a man by the name of Buck Colbert Franklin. He was an African-American lawyer and son of historian John Hope Franklin. In a recently discovered 10-page typed manuscript, Franklin describes the pogrom in vivid and frightening detail. He confirms the existence of the airplanes claimed to be flying overhead, which grew in number and hummed, darted, and dipped low. He also relates what sounded like hail falling upon the top of my office building, followed by the visualization of one structure after another burning from its top. Franklin recounts lurid flames roared and belched and licked their forked tongues into the air. Fleeing from his burning office, he witnessed sidewalks literally covered with burning turpentine balls and wondered when the Tulsa's well-staffed fire department would respond. Little did he know that mobs of armed whites prevented firefighters from entering Greenwood to put out the roaring blazes. Press accounts of what happened in Greenwood vary. An article written by Walter F. White, former executive secretary of the NAACP, and published a few weeks later after the pogrom, provides a striking account of the event. White was a mixed-race person with both African and European ancestors, and his features leaned toward the latter. Possessing white skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair, anyone who did not know anything about him would at first glance have perceived him to be a white person. This enabled him to infiltrate Tulsa and investigate the tragedy firsthand. In his article entitled The Eruption of Tulsa, published in The Nation on June 29th, White directs comments to everyone, and especially Americans. In the last paragraph of this expose, the author asks, "What is America going to do after such a horrible carnage?" White wants all people to be aware of the events that transpired in Greenwood and asks its citizens, how much longer will America allow these pogroms to continue unchecked? He makes it clear that the Tulsa Massacre offers a lesson for every American who believes that Negroes will always be the meek and submissive creatures that circumstances have forced them to be during the last 300 years. Finally, in the last two sentences of his account, White expresses concern for the future of his audience by wondering if America is waiting for a nationwide Tulsa to wake her. In regards to white supremacy, additional information must be made regarding the Ku Klux Klan and its relationship to the massacre of the residents of Greenwood. The Klan had been formed by 6 Confederate Army officers in Pulaski, Tennessee, on Christmas Eve of 1865. Being a secret terrorist organization, it is well known for its exploits in fostering white supremacy and black oppression. The KKK had a large following throughout the state of Oklahoma and was particularly strong in Tulsa in 1921, with Klan Number 2 composed of 3,200 members. There was even a women's chapter founded in 1923 and a junior KKK founded in 1924 for white boys 12 to 18. Tulsa police deputized Klan members to help with the Tulsa massacre in 1921. Survivors report that Klansmen roamed throughout the streets of the city, firing on blacks at will. One of the instigators of the massacre was a member of the organization. His name, Wyatt Tate Brady. He was a successful entrepreneur in the city who owned a general store and a hotel. He also operated a newspaper and assisted in developing Tulsa into a major city on the Oklahoma landscape. Brady was one of the signers of documents that made an official declaration of Tulsa a town once Oklahoma proclaimed its statehood in 1907. He was also the leader of a group within the Klan known as the Knights of Liberty, a white supremacist group that was instrumental in carrying out the operations of the 1921 pogrom. Reports of the events in Tulsa by white-owned newspapers portray the event as particularly threatening to whites. The Morning Tulsa World ran in its first June 1st, 1921 edition a headline that proclaimed 2 whites dead in race riot. The newspaper reported in its next edition that Negro snipers were shooting from housetops and windows. An article on the front page of the same edition maintained that the start of the violence was based on a statutory charge leveled against Dick Rowland. The same article asserts that a white elevator girl alleged that Rowland had attacked her. Another article that alarmed whites warned that based on a call from Muskogee, several hundred Negroes were on their way to the city to assist the Tulsa blacks. Still another front page article claimed that hundreds of armed blacks were gathering at First and Cincinnati for another invasion of the business district. And a different article portrayed the event as an uprising of the Negroes. On June 1st, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune, the other white-owned newspaper in Tulsa, ran an article concerning the elevator incident. It noted that Sarah Page, whose name was not disclosed, made a claim that Rowland attacked her, scratching her hands and face and tearing her clothes. The same newspaper most certainly ran an article entitled "To Lynch Negro Tonight" in a June 1st edition, based on interviews with people who read it. But all original copies of that issue of the paper have apparently been destroyed, and the relevant page is missing from the microfilm copy. So the exact content of the column and whether it existed at all remains in dispute. In sharp contrast to the accounts presented in white newspapers, black-owned publications presented a different perspective on what happened in Greenwood. The Crisis, a magazine published by the NAACP since 1910, notes in its July 21st issue that the pogrom had been planned for some time. 4 refugees from Okmulgee reported to the NAACP that warnings had been distributed weeks and months before the riot, telling colored people they would have to leave Oklahoma before June 1st or suffer the consequences. In the September 1921 issue, an article disclosed that the Tulsa police chief and 4 officers had been indicted for looting during the rioting, and that out of 88 indictments returned, 74 were against Negroes, upon whom the jury placed the blame for the riot. An Oklahoma newspaper, the Black Dispatch, published in Oklahoma City by Roscoe Dungy beginning in 1914, provided an interesting commentary on the Tulsa Massacre. In the June 3, 1921 issue, Dungy's editorial summed up the situation with the following: "This is white men's country." The argument is made that a certain element of people in Tulsa felt like it was their job to thrust this fiat down the throats of the Tulsa black population. The alleged assault on Sarah Page, which started the melee, was reported by Chief Detective James Patton that Rowland had grabbed her arm. Patton reported to the Tulsa World that yellow journalism had contributed to the riot. He stated that the afternoon paper came out with a colored and untrue account regarding what happened in the elevator. Patton concludes his remarks by declaring if the facts of the story as told by the police had only been printed, I do not think there would have been a riot whatever. The Dispatch also provided further information about the elevator incident in the June 10, 1921 edition. It noted that information provided by a white investigator in an interview with the proprietor of the Drexel building revealed that when he responded to the episode immediately after it occurred, Sarah Page was not bruised or her clothing disarranged in any way. In 1997, the Oklahoma Race Riot Commission began an investigation into the events surrounding the pogrom to explore the possibility of reparations for the families of the victims. They released their final report in February of 2000. After studying the massacre, the commission recommended that the survivors of the tragic 1921 event, along with their immediate families, be granted monetary compensation. It also called for the establishment of a memorial to the victims and a tax program which would facilitate further economic development in Greenwood. These suggestions were then passed on to the state legislature. However, even though the lawmakers of Oklahoma recognized and acknowledged the horror of the massacre, they refused to make direct payments to the survivors of the 1921 pogrom. Instead, monuments were set up to honor those who died. Statues were erected, and a plaque was created to commemorate the event. In 1918, the mayor of Tulsa, G.T. Bynum, decided that it was time to reinvestigate the Tulsa pogrom. As a result of his actions, more investigation was undertaken concerning the potential mass grave sites in the various cemeteries in Tulsa. As of today, those cemeteries are being investigated to see if additional victims of the worst pogrom in American history can be found.